Our scripture reading this morning are taken from the Old Testament. I will be reading Deuteronomy chapter 8, 1 through 3, and Isaiah 44, 21 through 22. Deuteronomy 8, 1 through 3. This entire commandment that I command you today, you must diligently observe so that you may live and increase and go in and occupy the land that the Lord promised on oath to your ancestors. Remember the long way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness in order to humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commandments. He humbled you by letting you hunger, then feeding you with manna, with which neither you nor your ancestors were acquainted, in order that to make you understand that one does not live alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Isaiah chapter 44, 21 through 22. Remember these things, O Jacob and Israel, for you are my servant. I formed you, you are my servant. O Israel, you will not be forgotten by me. I have swept away your transgressions like a cloud and your sins like mist. Return to me, for I have redeemed you. Our message this morning from Pastor Don Smith is how easily we forget. Pastor?
Thank you. I'm curious whether, as she read these two texts from the Old Testament, whether any of you felt that the words were directed to you. As remember the long way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness. Do you think of yourself as being led by God through all the years that Sturge has been here? Do you feel the same impact that those words had to Israel in the beginning, now that God has walked with Sturge all these years through all of the crises and the victories and the wonderful times that you've had and the hard times that you've had? Do you identify with those words for yourself? I remember years ago when I was in my second parish in Bernie, California, which is in the north. It's basically a lumber town, but it was a very small town. It wasn't incorporated. And the Presbyterian Church there played a significant role in the life of the parish. And during my early years there, I was in that parish for 13 years. So in the first or second year, a young couple decided that they wanted to come back into the Presbyterian Church and they wanted to join our congregation. He had been in seminary for 1 year to prepare for the Presbyterian ministry, but had left. And the couple had gone into Vista work. Do you remember Vista? It was a government program for people who wanted to be useful in other parts of the world and throughout the United States. And they gave a couple years of their lives to help other people. And they had been Vista workers. So I had them in communicants class, and the last class was at my home at the table, having lunch together after the service. And I had preached that day on the pilgrim people, using the metaphor of Israel going through the wilderness on the way to the promised land, with the church being a group of people who were also moving into the future with God in special ways, and that we needed to think of ourselves not as a permanent people, but as a people on the move to whatever destiny God had for us. And so when we were sitting at the table, I asked Frankie, the wife, what she thought about the sermon, because I knew that previously she had been engaged to a Jewish fella and had gone through Jewish instruction. And she started to say something polite. She said, you know, it was a nice sermon or something. And her husband, Jay, said, oh, tell him the truth. You didn't hear a word of what he said. And she said, well, she said, when I was in training for Judaism, she said, when the rabbis spoke about the travel through the wilderness, it was so real for them, you could almost smell the dust in your nostrils. And she said, I would hear you preach something about the exile or the Exodus, and she said, I would go right back into the class with the rabbis. And then I'd sort of come back to your sermon, and then I go right back to the rabbi. I took that as a compliment because I felt if I had been teaching something that was inauthentic, it would have bothered her and she wouldn't have, you know, it would have been a different kind of experience. But it helped me understand that for the Jewish community, remembering not just the event, but the experience was very important. I've just started reading Elie Wiesel. Now, do any of you know who Elie Wiesel is? Elie Wiesel was in the Holocaust and he survived it. And he wrote a number of books about the Holocaust. And the first one was called Night. It's part of a trilogy of Night, Dawn, and Day. And I've started reading the beginning of Night. And one of the things that Elie says is that how do you find words to describe the brutality and the cruelty of something like the Holocaust, and how painful it is to try to remember all that horrible existence. And yet, we have to remember it. We have to remember the extent of brutality that human beings can exert on other human beings. And so these words of the Old Testament are validated in the fact that both the victories and the gifts that God had given Israel and the keeping of the promise that God had made were important to remember, but also the sin of humanity we need to remember as well, because we can't gloss over the possibility that it may happen again. I mean, think about the killing fields in Cambodia. The Chinese Maoist government used to use prisoners' body parts to put them on the market to raise money. I mean, all kinds of things have happened in our history that we don't want to remember, but we must remember because we must see to it that it doesn't happen again. Now, thinking about the awful things and the victories God had shown them and wanted them to remember so that they would be faithful to him, if we think about our lives, what are the special memories that we have? Our weddings, special days, funerals for loved ones, the day of our baptism. I asked you a few weeks ago how many of you remembered your baptism, and I saw a number of hands go up. Are there special moments in our own history that we want to remember because they're so special? In my, I think my third parish, I was in Southern California and had a retreat with the officers and the school teachers, Sunday school teachers. And we worked on a timeline for the congregation. And there were 3 segments to wallpaper that I had gotten a roll of, and we were using the back of the wallpaper. And the top one was things that were personal: baptisms, births, membership when you came into the church, and so on. The second, third was the special events of the congregation. And then the third segment, I can't remember what the third, but there were three different categories. And we wrote things ourselves into that timeline that we could remember. And then we sat and just looked at it, tried to see the connection between these various things. And people would remember that their baptism or their wedding or whatever was when something else was going on in the church, and they remembered that. And as we looked at it, there was an insight that came because one of their pastors had suddenly gotten sick and died. And his name was Smith too. And he had preceded me at another parish earlier. And they noticed that there were periods where he had told them he was going to go somewhere else and then changed his mind and stayed. And they began to remember how he had done everything himself, all the new ideas, all the things that he had contributed to the parish had all been his ideas, and they hadn't really done much to help him. And suddenly it struck them that because of that, he may have gotten sick because of their lack of partnership with him. And you see, when we look backwards and we look at the past and we look at it analytically, we discover things that we hadn't thought of before. And all those things are important for us to remember so that, again, we don't make the same mistake. Or if it's something that really turned out well, we can do it again because it did turn out well. And so we have this encouragement to remember and not let go of things that are really significant, both negative and positive. I interviewed for a church in Wyoming years ago, and the church had belonged to the North American Presbyterian Church, and they had merged with the main body, the Presbyterian Church USA. And I was kind of excited about it because I'm a history fan. I like history. And I was looking forward to seeing all the documentation that they'd had before when they were a North American Presbyterian Church. And when I asked where all that stuff was kept, they looked down and they said, well, our pastor at that time told us to destroy it all because we were coming into a new relationship, and we shouldn't bring all that stuff with us into it. And I was crushed. Now, I didn't end up going there, but if I had, I really would have tried to work to recover as much as we could of their past history. And then the last thing I'll share with you is that I remember the man that said, when you have more memories than you have dreams, you're dying. And that's true too. We can get lost in our memories. We can get lost in the brutality and the wonder of victory of the past and forget that we are called as a pilgrim people to go forward with God. That from all the lessons we've learned in the past, it is also important that we put those lessons to work so that we can guide ourselves and let God be our shepherd as we move forward into the future. And that we can't let the past dictate what we do in the future. It can help us, it can give us wisdom, but it shouldn't hold us back to those places. It is easy to forget. We can fill our lives with all kinds of things that distract us from the lessons we have learned. One of the sad things that I've noted, and Lori has noted as well, is that many churches never learn from their past. They always start over again from scratch. And that's a shame, because the lessons we have learned in the past should educate us and inform us so that we do it better the next time. But if we don't hang on to the lessons learned, to the victories that God has given us, if we don't really experience where God has taken us in the past and look forward to seeing that again, we don't have the energy and the spirit to take us forward with God. It's too easy to forget him. I remember reading a book and using it as a study book when I was in Southern California, called The Window of Vulnerability. And the author said that it's only when we need God that we think about God. That when everything is fine and everything is going well and so on, we don't think about God very much because we don't need him, in our minds anyway. And that somehow we need to build into our daily life an expectation that we always need God, and that God will deliver us from those things that are troubling us and in the way of our lives for the future if we walk with God. And you remember I've seen hangings and other things of it. I was walking along the beach with the Lord, and most of the time there were 2 tracks, but once in a while there was only one. And I said to the Lord, "Why do you leave me?" And the Lord said, "Well, I'm not leaving you. That's when I pick you up and carry you." And that's a good thing to remember, that God is always with us, but there are times when we need God's help to take us along through a hard time, and that he is there to do that. And so that's part of this remembering, that God encouraged in his people so that when they got to the promised land, they wouldn't forget him because everything was going well. That Elie Wiesel encourages us to remember the Holocaust because of the brutality human beings worked on each other. And because we have much to remember that is good and beautiful and wonderful, but we can't get lost in those memories. We have to always think in terms of moving ahead with God to the kingdom that God has called us to.